Gilbert Kaplan, former Commerce Undersecretary for International Trade.
By saying, I think China could change course, and I was involved with negotiations with China. I filed the first CVD case ever against China. I think China could change. I don't, when you do a trade agreement, the other side always changes. I mean, there's no such thing as a trade agreement where the Japanese don't change or where people who join the WTO don't change. They all change because that's the whole point of a trade agreement. They're committing to do something, and you, as the U.S., are committing to do something. So I would not reach that conclusion quite so quickly. It looks pretty bad right now for obvious reasons, but I think there's it's worth still trying certain solutions. And even if you file these 337 cases and are able to shut out large amounts of product from China, it's invariably the case in trade cases that they almost always lead to trade negotiations. Large cases are often finished with some kind of negotiation, like the 301 in China was with the Phase 1 agreement. And lumber, there's been lumber cases forever against Canada. They always, or tend to always, lead to agreements. So there's a rule among trade lawyers that very large cases always end up in agreements. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Just a couple of quick comments, and then I want to, if there's anybody from the...
Sure.
Moderator Robert Atkinson, President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
And then we'll open up for some questions. I think one of the challenges, first of all, I 100% agree with everybody's comments that we should be thinking about an overhaul or revision, reform, improvements of all U.S. trade laws. The reason I think we need 337 is a simple one, is that it really hits the sweet spot between a 12-foot piece of pipe, which I know is important, Gil, and all imports coming from China in a particular industry, including from U.S. companies. Too broad. U.S. companies didn't do anything wrong. They're not getting, oftentimes these unfair provisions. It's the Chinese companies that are. So to me, this is a sweet spot. A good example to use would be the COMAC C919. There's no question, in my view, that in 10 years, Boeing and Airbus will be selling a lot fewer jets, single-aisle passenger jets in China. And the only reason to do that that'll happen is because China has massively subsidized a state-owned aerospace company that never should have existed. It never should have existed. It wouldn't have made any economic sense for the Chinese to do that. So they've massively subsidized it. They've told all of their state-owned airline companies, like Air China and others, you have to buy these COMAC planes. Why is that anywhere near a legitimate company with a legitimate product? So to me, that would be a great place for a 337 case to say, hey, Delta, United, American, Southwest, 10 or 20 years from now, you can't buy COMAC because it's not a legitimate product. So I think that's, to me, the advantage is it gives you this sort of sweet spot, not to sweep in a lot of other. There are legitimate Chinese companies. I don't want to deny that either, that are competing fairly, and we shouldn't be excluding them either. And the last point is Gil's point, which is, I think one of the key things in doing anything on trade is we have to do it in a way that maintains our rule of law. And there's a risk of going sort of with 301 where it's sort of capricious. At least with this case, as Gil, you noted, the Chinese companies can present their own defense. In fact, if you go and look at the MIIT Ministry of Industry and Information International Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. If you go and look at their website, and I cited in here, they actually list a bunch of trade law firms in Washington that they recommend that their firms use to win 337 cases. So they have every right in the world to come and buy the best lawyers in Washington, and they have every right to bring their case. And if they lose, they've lost legitimately. And to me, that's another advantage of this. It gives us a little bit more credibility. But any other comments folks want to make before we turn it over?
I just had one question in terms of defining amend 337 as if you're amending 337 as you propose, Rob. Is there a definition of what the unfair trade practice is? I mean, you've given that some thought.
So I use I obviously had to go through this quite quickly, but I use the there's an act Congress passed, I think, 2 years ago on forced labor, Uyghur forced labor, and they used a rebuttable presumption notion there. And I think that's a good legal principle where your standard doesn't have to be quite as high. But there should be some, and I agree with Gil, there can be, like for example, the OECD defines what is a fair export subsidy and what is not, export financing and what is not. So countries are allowed to use export financing. We use the Exim Bank, Europe has their own. And so they've defined that. And you're supposed to stay within that, the percentage of financing. China is 10 times more. So there would be kind of a clear case. If you're 2 times more, maybe you're okay, but above that, you're off. There could be the same kind of thing with subsidies as a share of sales. I use this in the paper. Even with our semiconductor subsidies, we're not going to be anywhere near the level of subsidies as a share of revenue that the Chinese companies have. So I don't think it can be a clear, black and white measure, but it could be, give some leeway. I think it could be quite close. Same thing with domestic markets. Certainly IP theft is clear as well.
Can I just ask about retaliation? Because that's a real concern in the China world, and China has a track record of retaliating, proportionally retaliating, like they did under the Section 301 under the Trump administration. But what you're talking about, this is, if you're talking about the kind of the injury, the value of the action, right? Let's just say keeping out Comax from the market, that would be a big price tag. And if the Chinese were to counter-retaliate, they probably wouldn't do it in that sector, but in other sectors. So, how do we work through that?
Yeah, so Wendy, that's a great point. I think there's really only sort of 2 fundamental things you can say. Well, you can say, well, they're going to retaliate a little bit like the mafia. You don't want to mess with the mafia, you're going to get retaliated against. They're going to retaliate. So the question then is, why don't we just give up? The pain is too great. And I think ultimately we have to say we cannot do that because we know what the end game will be. The end game will be Comac will have a big share of the global market. We know the Chinese electric vehicle companies have a big share of the market. We'll know like Huawei has a big share. I think what we have to do, and this is a critical point that I couldn't touch on too much, we have to do this with our allies because at some point they can only retaliate so much if their opponents, if you will, are weakened. And that's why I was so heartened by the new EU law on subsidies. I've talked to some EU members of parliament who seem kind of interested in this. I think the Japanese would be interested. So ideally, this would be something that the Biden administration or a follow-on administration in 25 would say, let's see if we can get a bunch of our allies to agree to some kind of similar thing. So I agree that's the risk. But I think if we can get a few core allies involved, then retaliation risks go down significantly. Yeah. There's a mic back there. Yeah. In the back of the room. If anybody has questions, you can line up behind it.
My name is Pat Malloy. I'm a trade lawyer, but I've been in government and I've been on the China Commission for a number of years. And I appreciate very much this panel and all you're doing and the need for a review of our trade laws. You will all have talked about forced technology transfers as being that the Chinese use that to get our companies to transfer technology and R&D and other things to them. When I first went to China in 81, I saw a poverty-stricken country. I've been there many times, including when I was on the China Commission for 10 years. And what I saw, our corporations were focused on enriching shareholders. That was what they said their responsibility was on the Business Roundtable website. So the Chinese would say, if you want to be a friend of China and do better here, you should transfer technology or put an R&D lab and other things here. And the American companies were enticed to do that. Now there's something in the Congress right now that has passed the House called the Casey-Cornin provision, which is in the House China bill. It's not in the Senate China bill, but they're in conference still on this bill. The administration strongly supports the Casey-Cornin provision and says it may have to do it by executive order if Congress doesn't get that provision passed. Where does this panel think about the KC quantum provision, which would say to our companies, we can review some of the things that you're putting into China and maybe prohibit it. So that's a very important provision of law, and I just want to see what this panel thinks of that kind of provision. Thank you very much for letting me put that question to you.
Well, I'd just say quickly, if you look at the very first company that transferred technology in China to Huawei, it was a long report I wrote about it called Who Lost Wow? Who Lost Lucid? Why don't we have a telecom industry? The very
Robert Atkinson.
Belgium. They were the ones that sort of broke ranks. No, Lucid didn't want to do it. Nortel didn't want to do it. But Belgium was weak, and they were weak economically. They said, sure, we'll do a deal because then we'll get some market share. And once they did that, then you had Siemens do it, you had Lucid do it, So, Pat, this is not just American companies. This is everybody who does this because they have a gun to their head. They're told you either do this or you don't get access to the market, which is why I'm more sympathetic to Senator Warner's point. If we do this unilaterally, I just think the result will be American company will be shut out. I think we have to do this with Japanese, our allies, Koreans, and Europeans. Other comments?
I haven't looked at that act for a while, so I don't specifically say. I'm not exactly sure about that act, all the provisions in that act. I haven't looked at that for a while, but I totally support having a review mechanism on investments or capital flows from the United States to China. I think we absolutely have to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have a question. John, also from the U.S.-China Commission. My question is on the horizon scanning mechanism that Meredith, thank you brought up. Where in government currently do you think would be best suited for such a capacity to actually look at where Chinese subsidies might be coming down? And should there be consequences that stem from analyses based on that horizon scan?
I'm not suggesting a particular place at this point. I think, we have a lot of work that goes on in government looking for cases, looking for trends. A lot of this, and Gil knows more about what goes on at the Commerce Department